Hello, everyone, and welcome. The General Mills Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition is pleased to present our webinar today, Eating Well for Aging Well. My name is Michelle Tucker. I'm a registered dietitian and nutrition scientist at the General Mills Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition. I'll be your host for today's webinar. If you're not familiar with the Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition, we are a dedicated group within General Mills whose mission is to be the source of health and nutrition that creates value and growth for our brands. We believe food should make us better, so we work hard to make food people love while improving the nutrition of our products. Feel free to follow us on social media. Now, before we begin today's program, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping matters. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recorded webinar, along with the presentation slides, will be available within a few weeks on generalmillscf.com. At the end of today's webinar, we'll have a Q&A period. However, you can submit questions at any time during the webinar by using the chat feature located on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. After the webinar concludes today, you will be asked to fill out a short survey and will receive an email with links to the slides and continuing education credit certificates. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Dr. Christine Rosenblum. Dr. Rosenblum has been compensated by General Mills to do this webinar. Dr. Rosenblum is president of Chris Rosenblum Food and Nutrition Services, LLC. She enjoys working with a variety of food nutrition partners to synthesize nutrition research literature and develop communications for health professionals and consumers. In October of 2017, Dr. Rosenblum, along with Dr. Bob Murray, published Food and Fitness After 50, featuring information on eating well, moving well, and being well for adults in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond, which is the topic you'll be hearing about today. Dr. Rosenblum is a professor emerita of nutrition at Georgia State University, where for 30 years she held various teaching and administrative positions, including department chair and associate dean. She is an active member of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics and was an Academy spokesperson for 11 years. Dr. Rosenblum received a Bachelor of Science in Food and Nutrition from Kent State University in 1973 and completed her dietetic internship at the University of Minnesota. Her doctorate was earned in sociology with a gerontology concentration from Georgia State University in 1989. Please welcome our speaker, Dr. Christine Rosenblum. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm delighted to be here with you all this afternoon, and I hope that you're having a great day, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. As Michelle said, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is eating well for aging well today. I do have some disclosures. They're on this slide, and I do want to thank the General Mills Bell Institute of Health and Nutrition for sponsoring our webinar today. And I also want to thank my co-author, Dr. Bob Murray. He is letting me use some of the slides that we'll talk about a little later on functional fitness. So some of you might know Dr. Bob. He's in the Chicago area, and he's an exercise physiologist. We also have objectives, and I won't read these to you, but we do have objectives, and we plan to cover all of these today by the end of the webinar. In order to age well, we really need three things. We need to eat well, we need to move well, and we need to be well. But today we're going to focus on eating well, but do keep in mind all three are important for good health. We will touch on the moving well and being well piece, but we're really going to focus on the eating well. Before we get into that piece, I think you all recognize the changing landscape in the United States in terms of our aging population. And when I was doing research, this quote really stuck out for me. There are more people on the planet over the age of 65 than ever before in human history. I think that's really an amazing statistic. And if you just look at the growth in numbers of millions of people and percent of the population, you can see that this trend is going to continue to grow. We also know that it's not shown on this slide that the 85-plus population is projected to triple from 6.3 million to 14.6 million by 2040. So I think those are things that are important to keep in mind as we're talking about what we can do to keep ourselves well into our older ages. I want to start by just giving a brief overview of some of the physiological changes with aging. I think it's really important to keep in mind that it's hard to untangle normal aging from usual aging when disuse is the norm. So if people are very sedentary and they're not active and they're not eating well, it's really hard to know how much of that is lifestyle versus how much of that is just a real physiological change. Another reason I think this is super important is that when you reach the age of 65 in the United States, you have a life expectancy of an additional 20 years. Now, I'm 67. Those of you who did the math from Michelle's intro could probably figure that out. And I don't know about you, but I want to spend my last years, let's say I have 20 more left, I want to be as active and independent as I can. I've never met anyone who said, I can't wait till I'm old so I can be in a wheelchair, so I cannot be independent, so that I can't do the things that I love to do. So I think that there's so many things we can do, even though as we get older, things are going to happen, and we will touch on that. So that sort of sets the stage for me about where we are and what we want to talk about today. There are changes that occur in every system in the body. And so no matter what we do, we're not ever going to be as fit or as young or whatever at 65 as we were at 20. But there are many things that we can do to make sure that we can maintain our functional independence. In terms of the cardiovascular system, we know that there's changes in the blood vessels, there are changes in the heart, muscle itself, and all of these changes, even the normal changes, do make the heart less responsive to stress. So under a stressful situation, whether it's physical or emotional stress, the heart can be challenged with that. In terms of our skeletal system, we know, and probably all of you realize this, is that the diseases of the skeletal system really start in adolescence. About 40 to 50% of our peak bone mass is achieved in adolescence. And starting about age 40, I hate to say this, but age 40 is really the start of the decline of many systems. So we might think we're in our peak in our 40s, but we're starting to see some changes. So about the fourth decade, we start to see a decline in our bone density and our bone strength. And especially for women, those first 5 years after menopause, there's a decline. The decline will start to slow after the first 5 years, but it never fully recovers. And osteoporosis is a disease that there's really poor treatment for. So we really don't have any cure for that. So we want to do everything we can to keep our bones strong as we go into our older years. In terms of our muscle, there's some really good news here because we really can turn back the clock when it comes to muscle. But if we're not active, we can have about a 1% loss per year starting about age 40 and even greater declines after the age of 65 in our muscle mass. And then muscle strength also progresses rapidly, about 2 to 4% per year after 65. So we lose not only mass, but we lose strength. 70-year-olds are 30% weaker than they were at 50. And that's a really big drop in just 20 years. But as I said, the great news is that muscles adapt to the environment. They can either wither and develop sarcopenia, which literally means vanishing flesh, or they can become strong when they're physically stressed. So we're going to hit on that part a little bit more today. I'm going to go back one more. I quickly went forward because I'm skipping over body composition, which I know nobody wants to skip over because this is a big concern for many people. A lot of the older people that I talk to are concerned about their changes that their body starts undergoing, usually around menopause for women. There is an increase in the dreaded belly fat or abdominal fat. There is increase in depositions of fat in lots of organ systems, and we can see increases in body weight up until around the age of 70. There's also a redistribution of fat. The fat leaves the extremities, so you'll see thinner arms and legs and more fat on the trunk or more of that visceral fat. And one of the other changes is some of the things that affect our hydration status. And my co-author, Bob Murray, loves to say, so I'm quoting him, the human body is basically a leaky bag of water with legs. So as we get older, we have less body water. First 6 months of life, we're about 75% water. Then that decreases and hovers around 60% for most of our lives. And if we have a lot of body fat, that can increase, or that can decrease to about 50%. So we don't have as much body water. We also have a decreased sense, especially when we're dehydrated. We have a decreased ability to concentrate the urine and less sweat produced. And then, of course, some of the medications that we take, some of the diuretics for high blood pressure, and even some dietary supplements can increase urine production. So the hydration is another important piece of making sure that we're staying well as we get old. I also hear, and I'm sure some of you do too, a lot of misguided nutrition advice. These are all things that I've heard recently. Somebody said to me just the other day, I'm really glad I'm getting over my fear of carbs, but then I was at a baby shower and a woman said she was a nutritionist and told me never, ever, ever eat carbs. I had to back up and explain that not all nutritionists really have a lot of good information. So they're not dietitians. They're not, people that are like you that are all involved in the field in some way. And so it is important to make sure that you're getting your advice from people who really know what they're talking about. But because protein's on people's mind, they think that's the only nutrient. We're hearing a lot about ketogenic diets and people oxidizing more fat. We're hearing people say, I can't eat fruit. It's got too much sugar. And, of course, we all know what sugar is. So I think that a lot of older people are interested in nutrition advice. But as with all groups, they're getting a lot of misinformation. So the question I'm asked the most is, what is the best diet for aging well? And my answer is there really is no best diet, but there are lots of good choices. And I think right now the emphasis is really on dietary patterns, so we're going to look at some of those today too. So some of the components that I think are most important and that the literature bears out is that we want people to have all the energy-containing nutrients, carbohydrate, protein, fat, no carb, no all protein, no high fat, a balance of all. We want to focus on nutrient-rich foods. As we get older, our energy needs decrease, so we want to get more nutrients in those packages of energy. We want to have less calories, but we still need the nutrients. In some cases, we even need more nutrients. So I know we talk about nutrient-rich foods, we talk about nutrient-dense foods, but Julie Miller-Jones, we're going to comment to a quote from her a little bit later. She likes to talk about nutrient-intense foods, and I think that really makes a lot of sense as we get older to think about what's the nutrient package that I'm getting out of those calories. We also have to think about that concern for disease risk and disease management. Even people that are healthy are going to have high blood pressure, they may have heart disease, and they may be cancer survivors. And then, of course, we want people to enjoy their meals and enjoy eating and enjoy mealtime. I just find right now that so many people are afraid of their food, and we really would love to help them get over that fear of eating and fear of what's in their food and have more enjoyment of food. The International Food Information Council has a survey every year, and they found that one of the things people are really interested in is the health benefits from foods and nutrients. And the top three you'll see on this slide are cardiovascular health, which makes sense since cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death in the U.S. for both men and women. They're concerned about weight loss and weight management, and they want more energy. And so those are the top benefits. And then at the top of this slide, you'll see that also older adults rank bone health and diabetes management are some of the benefits that they're looking from food. So one way to put that together is this idea of a My Plate for older adults. And I like this for a couple of reasons. It does do the total diet approach. It also focuses on those foods that we know we want people to eat more of. But it also talks about herbs and spices, how we can get some flavor into our food without using a lot of salt. Many older adults are trying to at least moderate their salt intake. And the other thing I like about this chart, it does talk about fluids and the importance of that, and then also grains. And not just whole grains, but whole grains and fortified and refined grains. Remember, the dietary guidelines say make half your grains whole. So if you enjoy jasmine rice or basmati rice with Indian food or Thai food, that's fine. It doesn't always have to be brown rice, always have to be whole grains. The 4 plans that I think work well for older adults, and there could be others, but these are the ones that tend to come up as plans that I think work well. Of course, the DASH plan, everyone's probably familiar with the dietary approaches to stop hypertension. A Mediterranean diet, it gets a lot of attention in the media. I find people don't always know what a Mediterranean diet is. They think, well, I'll just go to Olive Garden, I'll eat unlimited breadsticks and salad. That's not really a Mediterranean diet. I like a flexitarian diet approach. A lot of older adults, they're not really ready to go vegan. They don't have to go vegan, but a flexitarian diet is more plant-based, but it gives you that option. When Thanksgiving comes around, you can eat the turkey and enjoy it with your family, not have to have the tofurkey because you've decided you're a vegetarian. So I like flexitarian plans. And then I think the last one that's getting some attention is called the Mind Diet. So it's got a great name, but it's really a combination of the Mediterranean and the DASH diet. This is a healthy diet with lots of good foods. Right now, I think the core premise that it can prevent or stop cognitive decline might be a little premature, but there is a big randomized control trial underway. It's not due to be complete till 2021 about this diet, but it's undertaken by Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. So they've got good observational data, and now they're taking it to the next step and really looking at it in a controlled fashion. Why do we like these 4 plans? Well, you know, it's pretty obvious, I think. They all feature wholesome foods. They feature the foods that we know give people health benefits, and they also feature some of the healthy, heart-healthy fats, and they limit those foods that are higher in saturated fat and added sugars. I want to take a brief minute now to look at, drill down a little bit and talk about the importance of both carbohydrate and protein in aging well and some of the recommendations for that. This is a quote that I love from the late Mel Williams, and I used his textbook to teach sports nutrition for years and years and years. And he said that one of the most important nutrients in your diet from the standpoint of both health and athletic performance is dietary carbohydrate. So a lot of older adults are trying to be more active. When they're retired, they have time to go to the Y and to be more active. So they need carbohydrates to help fuel some of that activity. But there are a lot of concerns, or I'd say some misunderstandings about carbs. There is a carb phobia. There's a fear of weight gain. So a lot of people say, well, it's just easy to cut out bread. I'll just cut out carbs and that'll make me lose weight. And I think there's an inadequate understanding of some of the basic nutrition concepts, especially around nutrition and activity. Active adults are going to need carbohydrate if they want to stay active and they want to increase their intensity. You know, from grain brain to wheat belly, many are just shunning carbs. They think they're going to fuel an unhealthy lifestyle, and some underconsume them, then some overconsume them at the wrong time. So trying to help adults get to that balance, I think, is really helpful. We know that there's some effects of having inadequate carbohydrate availability. We can have a lack of general energy. Muscle fatigue and breakdown, confused thinking. Remember, the brain relies on carbohydrate as a fuel to produce ATP or energy. And also for those who are active, an inability to work at a higher intensity. Carbohydrate's the only fuel that can be used anaerobically, or that without oxygen at high intensity. I wanted to share this example with you because this is the kind of thing I think a lot of people in nutrition hear about. So this is an actual person that's a friend of mine who plays pickleball, one of the hottest sports among older adults. And she plays pickleball in the mornings, and she starts about 7:30 and plays for a couple hours. So she said, you know, I'm really flagging. I'm not finishing my workout. I'm not strong, but it's too early for me to eat. So I said, well, you know, just get some little bit of carbohydrate, just 25, 30 grams of carbohydrate. Saw her a couple weeks later. She said, oh, boy, I don't know what's going on. I'm actually putting some weight on, and I'm not feeling that great. So I said, well, what are you eating? Well, she was eating a 250-calorie energy bar that had 45 grams of carbohydrate and a 20-ounce bottle of sports drink that had 13 grams of carbohydrate. So she was getting a total of 60 grams of carbs. So, you know, at least, you know, double what she needs, if not more. So I think, you know, as a dietitian, something that I forget that people really don't know what a gram of carbohydrate looks like. So just some examples that are realistic for people so they know it doesn't have to be a whole lot of food. That little bit of 6-ounce fruited yogurt will do the trick. And I had to include mac and cheese in here. I live in Georgia, and mac and cheese is a vegetable. So I always think it's funny that it's really a carbohydrate and fat-rich food and protein, but here it's a vegetable. The next thing we'll flip over to and talk a little bit about is the importance of maintaining both muscle mass and strength with aging. These are two examples of people that are pretty inspiring. We're going to come back to Clarence Bath. Clarence is 60 years old in this photo. He's now 80. And Ernestine Shepard is another amazing woman. She is now 81, and she holds the Guinness World Book of Records for the strongest woman in terms of being competitive bodybuilder at older ages. They are the exception, but I think it's important to look at inspiring people. There are some of these changes with muscle mass and strength as we age, and I think it's interesting to look at that, again, middle age starting about 40. And so what we want to do is be able to not only maintain the mass but the strength, because they're both really important for functional fitness as we get older. So there's a fitness gap there. If you're not staying active, if you're not doing some resistance training, you can lose that muscle mass, and then that can lead to loss of independence, chronic disease, and early mortality. I always say that for me, functional fitness is my goal. I want to be able to do two things. I want to lift my suitcase in the overhead bin while I travel on my own, not look for somebody else to do it for me. And I want to pick up a 50-pound bag of dog food when I'm in the store to feed my big dogs. So those are things to me that are important to have a good functional fitness and quality of life. This is probably a slide that you've seen as well, too. And this picture is showing the cross-section or MRI of a thigh of a 25-year-old active person and then a 63-year-old who is inactive. You can just see the increase in fat. You can see the increase of fat not only on the subcutaneous around the muscle, but that's infiltrated into the muscle. And that can lead to both muscle mass and strength loss. Then as you're trying to be active, there's an increased perceived exertion that can further reduce your intensity, so it can be a real vicious cycle. And this also takes that around even further, that loss of muscle, loss of strength, reduced function, which can lead to falls, fracture, even metabolic disease. Some studies have shown that older adults may spend up to 85% of their waking hours being sedentary. So even if you exercise for an hour in the morning, if you're sitting around the rest of the day, you're not being really active. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do to combat that. There's one other thing, kind of gives us this double, triple whammy, if you will, and that is called the age-related anabolic resistance. It seems that older muscle responds less well to the anabolic stimulus of dietary protein, and they call that anabolic resistance. So it could be underpinned by some muscle signaling pathways, but we know that just the amount of protein that it would take a younger person to stimulate muscle protein synthesis is not going to be enough for an older person. So we'll talk about some of the nutrition guidelines that can help with that. These are some recommendations from some scientific groups that are saying that the RDA is really not sufficient for an older population. So the minimum protein intake for healthy older adults should be probably elevated. Now, 25 to 50% sounds like a huge amount, but we're talking about 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram of body weight. But then someone who has acute or chronic disease, higher, and then those older adults that have severe illness or injury or malnutrition need to get up even higher. And within that, there's a key amino acid. It's called leucine. You probably are familiar with it. It's one of the branched-chain amino acids. But leucine is the anabolic trigger. It seems to really help elevate the plasma level of the leucine, which then stimulates muscle protein synthesis. And so the recommendation is for us to get more protein throughout the day and then to make sure we're getting leucine-rich foods. So you can see from this slide that the animal sources have more leucine. I won't necessarily say more leucine, but you need less food when you're using an animal protein to get the leucine level. And then plant sources, you might need to have a little bit more to reach that level of 2.5 grams of leucine. But of course, you can do that with a combination of foods. One of the reasons that we love yogurt so much for older adults is that it is a great source of not only leucine, the amino acid, but of whey protein and casein protein as well. So the current guidelines are for us to get about 30 to 40 grams of protein per meal with that leucine rich foods per meal as well. Now, I will tell you that this is probably somewhat controversial only because if you got 4 protein researchers in a room, they would probably all give you a little different take on this, but right now this is what we're looking at. Another way to look at that, and I don't have it written on the slide, but it turns out to be about 0.6, so 0.6 grams of protein per pound of body weight. So if you take a 145-pound woman, multiply it times 0.6, it's about 87 grams of protein a day, which would be about 30 grams per meal. So that's one easy way to look at it. Another thing is to spread that protein throughout the day. Average protein intake is about less than 15 grams at breakfast, and we get the majority of it backloaded at dinner. So that idea of trying to eat less protein at dinner and then spread that out for breakfast and lunch so that we can get that protein boost to help stimulate muscle protein synthesis throughout the day. Well, we also know that nutrient package is important. So what are some of the nutrients that people are missing out on? What are some of the nutrients and food groups that are shortfall nutrients? Well, from the 2015 dietary guidelines, we know that there are some nutrients of public health concern, and those are probably ones that wouldn't be surprising to you. And I think another aspect that I like to really emphasize is the idea of fortified foods because they can put those extra vitamins, minerals, probiotics, all those things that we know are important for good health into food that we already like. So I think using fortified foods really can be a real benefit for older people. And then in terms of some of the specifics, we know that the percentage here of the 51 plus population are not meeting the recommendations for the nutrients that are listed here. And then I think the bottom in the orange box is really telling. Only 12% of 51 plus adults are meeting the recommendations for dietary fiber and only 1% for potassium. So we're going to drill down a little bit on those as well. In terms of the food groups, this really highlights where they're not getting enough of the nutrients from food groups, and that would include not getting enough fruits and vegetables, not getting enough dairy foods, not getting enough whole grains, and not getting enough seafood as a protein source. So that's the big picture in terms of some of the food groups that people are missing. So we'll even drill down a little bit further. We just keep drilling down and talk about some of these nutrients that are important. And I mentioned Julie Miller-Jones earlier, and I love this quote from her. I heard at a conference a couple years ago. She said, we should be talking about fibers with an S on the end, like we talk about vitamins, because they do different things for our health. Many people believe that fruit and vegetables provide all the fiber anyone needs, but it's hard to reach fiber goals without including grains. And some of you may realize that, even an apple, which is a great source of fiber, it doesn't have as much fiber as, let's say, a whole grain breakfast cereal. So I think that we need to think about including grains in there to reach those fiber goals. This is a picture, is not my breakfast, but it could be. Because my breakfast every morning really hits at that high fiber breakfast cereal. I like Fiber One as an addition to other breakfast cereals because let's face it, those high fiber cereals, they don't taste great, but they provide a whopping amount of fiber. Just a half a cup, depending on the cereal, can be 9 to 14 grams of fiber. So I always add Fiber One to my breakfast cereal and then add some berries so that I can help to boost my fiber intake. And then for older adults too, there's a lot of concern about regularity and making sure that bowel movements are good. So fiber can really help with that. And I think that's a point that we should emphasize. Another nutrient that we have listed here is potassium. Remember how pitiful it was. Only 1% are meeting the adequate intake of 4,700 milligrams a day for older adults. What are the top sources of potassium in the U.S. diet? What do you think those are? We don't have a polling question, but think about it. If you said bananas, you're wrong. The answer is milk, coffee, tea, and potatoes. Now, probably because we eat or drink more of those foods. But it's important when people say, well, I'm cutting out all my potatoes. Well, if that's a source of potassium for a lot of people, we want to make sure that they're not afraid of potatoes, or that they're getting their potassium from some other sources. So as people are eating less with aging, you want to make sure that they're getting those nutrients along with that. Another nutrient that I find a lot of confusion about is calcium. And I think it stems back to some of these headlines back from 2012, where there were all kinds of headlines. And this is all the same study, but you can see how differently it's treated from the Huffington Post, WebMD, or the New York Daily News about calcium supplements can give you a heart attack, right? So people, doctors alike, said don't take calcium supplements anymore. I think that was probably some misguided advice. There's some good research from the Framingham Offspring study that does not support dietary calcium or supplemental calcium contributing to calcium deposits in arteries. And so I won't go over the research study there, but there is a good study that actually used CT scans to determine if these were contributing to calcium deposition. So the bottom line is that men and women need adequate calcium from diet and or supplements, but more isn't better. I like to direct people to the International Osteoporosis Foundation online calculator. That can help them determine what their usual calcium intake is, and then they can either try to find a food that boosts their calcium intake, or they might need to take supplements, but they don't need to take all 1,200 milligrams of calcium from a supplement. They might be able to get it with the food and then a smaller dose of supplement. Just remember, for men and women, that recommended intake is about 1,000 a day for men, up to 70, and 1,200 milligrams for women. And then after the age of 71, both men and women need 1,200 milligrams a day. And a lot of people are woefully short. Vitamin D is another one of those nutrients that I think there's some controversy about, because I don't think we really know the best blood levels for that. But we do know that without sufficient vitamin D, only 10 to 15% of calcium is absorbed. As we get older, our skin production declines with age for vitamin D. Also, the kidney doesn't convert it as rapidly to an active form. So the International Osteoporosis Foundation recommends that all older adults get 800 to 1,000 IUs a day, and that can help prevent fall and fracture prevention in those that are older. So I think it's nice to get your vitamin D level measured, and then look at some food sources that are fortified. You know, it's hard to get vitamin D in food, but some of the breakfast cereals, some yogurts, not all, but some yogurts are fortified with vitamin D. So make sure that you're choosing those nutrient-dense packages that are fortified with vitamin D when you're choosing a food. Another nutrient that's really interesting right now is the idea about omega-3s that can help support muscle protein synthesis. We saw earlier in terms of a food group that people aren't getting the recommended amount of seafood, and I hate to tell you this, but tilapia, while it tastes great, is not a rich source of omega-3 fatty acids. You really need those fatty fish like salmon and albacore tuna and herring, and some of the fish that we don't tend to eat as much in the U.S. So in one study, just using 2 grams a day, that helped to support the gains in muscle mass and strength in older women after 3 months of resistance training. So it's emerging, but it's something I'd keep an eye on, because omega-3s might not just be good for the cardiovascular system and for blood clotting, but it also might be a good therapy to help support muscle mass. And the last nutrient that I wanted to talk about was B12. And I think this is an interesting example of where, as we get older, the RDA isn't changed than it is from younger adults, but it's actually recommended that a synthetic B12 be used for better absorption, either in fortified foods or in supplements. 30 to 40% of older adults have challenges absorbing that food-bound vitamin B12. And an additional 10 to 30% have atrophic gastritis. And that problem with hydrochloric acid might increase the growth of normal intestinal bacteria that use B12. So that would further reduce the amount that's available. So I know everybody thinks natural is better, but here's a great example where synthetic B12 is going to be better for an older population. Okay, I want to move on now for the last little piece and talk a little bit about some of these aspects about the moving well piece, because I think that's another thing that we just can't overlook as we're getting older. And when people say, well, what's the best? Well, the best is what you like to do. I love group exercise classes. Some of you might hate them. So it just depends on what you like to do. But whatever you like to do, you really need to have all three of these components. You need strength, you need endurance, and you need balance. The dietary guidelines first suggested that we include physical activity back in 1995, and the recommendations are that we get 150 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic exercise every week. That boils down to about 30 minutes, moderate intensity though, so you really got to up your game a little bit. And then to do muscle strengthening exercises, working all major muscle groups a couple of times a week. So it doesn't take a lot to do that. We also know that regular physical activity improves our health. So even if you're not losing weight from exercise, and people sometimes give up because they think, oh, I'm exercising, but I'm not losing any weight. Exercise is going to really help your health. So that's the most important thing to keep in mind. We know that only 24% of older adults are meeting these minimum guidelines for physical activity. So some of the things that we can suggest is we want to just reduce sedentary behavior. Any movement is better than no movement. And my colleague Bob likes to talk about periodic activity snacks during the day. So that might be just getting up from your desk or chair and doing some squats behind your chair, walking up and down the stairs if you have stairs in your office or your home, just little things to keep that activity level high. And the other thing that's important is that we want to have multi-component and dual exercise, dual activity. So what we want to do is, those things like a basketball game or tennis or pickleball where we're moving and we're having some agility as well. The goal is also to raise heart and breathing rate. We need to challenge our muscles, and that includes our heart muscle, so we need to challenge that. And one of my favorite sayings came from a fitness instructor that I had at the YMCA, and this is an article about her from a blog that I write called Fit to Eat, where I interview older people and really find out what they do to inspire us to stay active and to eat well. And she always said in her exercise class, no challenge, no change. So she would mix it up so that we'd be doing something different all the time so that we make sure that we have different activities to stimulate those muscles. If all you do is lift 5-pound weights, you might have some endurance in your muscle, but you're not going to have change to that muscle. Now, there is one important tip to avoid early death, and I think you're really going to appreciate this, and that is walk faster than the Grim Reaper. In a study out of Australia, they really tried to look at people at walking speed and how they, could decrease their mortality, and they found that those that walked about 3 miles an hour or faster, that's about a 20-minute mile, they stayed out in front of the Grim Reaper. So they determined that the Grim Reaper walks at about 2 miles an hour. So just think about that next time you're out for a stroll. Try to pick up that pace so that you can stay ahead of the Grim Reaper. That resistance training is also important. So as this slide says, refusing to go to the gym is not the same as resistance training. But I also think that, just remember that it doesn't have to be going to the gym. You can use TheraBands. You can lift, hand weights at your house. You can use those other exercise tubings, little things like that that can really help you keep resistance training without having to go to the gym and be intimidated by the machines. I know I am. I do it, but I'm intimidated. Another thing that's really critical is this idea of agility, balance, and coordination. We all want to be able to be active, to play with our grandkids, to be able to do those things that we want. So we need these ideas of the ABCs. We don't want to fall. We want to be well coordinated. My husband loved to play basketball most of his life, and he said it's so hard now that he's in his late 60s. He said, my mind still wants to go for that layup, but my body just doesn't cooperate. So he doesn't have quite the agility and the coordination that he used to have. But we can get that back by continuing to work on it. Okay, and the last piece that I want to talk about is this idea of being well. And we'll just briefly talk about the components for being well. And you could probably name more, but the ones that I think are important, and as you can tell, I like alliteration. So sleep, stress, and social support. Older people need the same amount of sleep. We all need about 8 hours of sleep a night. And I know, though, that our sleep patterns can shorten. Our sleep patterns can become more disturbed as we get older, and hormonal challenges can also make that a problem. About 60% of women going through menopause really complain about disrupted sleep patterns with hot flashes. And then our circadian rhythms can also change. So some of the things that we recommend are sleeping in a dark room. Don't keep your cell phone next to the bed with the alerts going on. Don't stick the cell phone in your face right before you go to bed so the light from the screen stimulates your brain. And keep the room cool. Maybe even use a fan in the wintertime or a little low ambient noise that can help you get better sleep. We also know that we can't remove stress from our life, but we can develop resilience to deal with stress. So I think that idea of what can we do to help moderate the stress, sometimes physical activity is great, sometimes it's a religious organization or some spiritual things that people do can all to help to relieve some of that stress in our lives. And then social support is also so critical. There's a Harvard study of adult development that began in the 30s and continued for more than 75 years. And they asked the questions, what makes people happy? And what makes people happy isn't health or wealth, it's relationships, and it's good relationships. So having social support, especially for men as they get older, is really important. A lot of men rely, especially in this cohort, rely on their women, their wives, the women in their lives for their social support. And so men need to develop their own social support systems in order to be well as they get older. Well, in conclusion, I want to talk about a few things that inspire me. And it's never too late. I think that's a key message, to eat well, to move well, and to be well. And here's a photo of a woman named Sister Madonna Butter. She's also known as the Iron Nun. And Sister Butter was the oldest person to finish an Ironman triathlon in under the 17-hour time limit at the age of 82. She's now 88. And she has run 45 Ironman triathlons. For those of you who don't know what that is, that's a 2.4-mile swim, a 112-mile bike ride, and a full marathon of 26.2 miles. So I get tired just thinking about that. And then there's another woman named Ida Keeling who at 100 years old broke the 80-year and over world record at the Penn Relays for the 100-yard dash. She didn't start exercising until she was 67 years old. So it is never too late to eat well, move well, and be well. And then these are some of the people that I've interviewed in my blog, and they've given me permission to show their pictures. And if any of you in the dietitian world, you might know some of these people. The first is Constance Brown-Riggs, and she says she's outrunning diabetes. She has a major family history of diabetes, and she's doing everything she can. So she started working with trainers. She's doing weight training. She's running, and really from that has really curtailed chronic disease. The person in the middle is a friend of mine. She's 80 years old, and she still does yoga every day. And I think we would all admit that she's a little bit more flexible than many of us. And the person at the end is a dietitian's mother. You might know Lisa Carlson. This is her mother, Elizabeth, who just turned 90. And she has a love of learning. She's learning something new, so she's really living that being well piece. I mentioned Clarence Bath earlier, and I wanted to come back to him. He is a fitness writer. He started writing for the precursor to Muscle and Fitness magazine when he was in his teens. And he said one of the things he had to do every year was take a photo shoot of himself. He said that will really keep you motivated to look good. So here he is at age 27. You can see him at age 44. Earlier in the slide deck, we saw him at 60, and here he is at 80. Obviously, there's been changes. He's never going to be the same, but I think we would all be impressed that he's kept his body fat level low, and he's kept a good muscle tone even into his 80s. So I would encourage you all to use my email address if you have any further questions or want to discuss this. I do have a blog called Fit to Eat, and it does feature inspiring people over the age of 50 and on, and I encourage you to look at that. Or if you want to nominate yourself, shoot me an email, and I'd be happy to interview you. And you can follow me on Twitter, and you can also see my website. So with that, I think we have time for questions. I'll turn it back over to Michelle.
Thank you, Dr. Rosenblum. That was very informative. And now we do have time for a couple questions and answers, and we've already received some really great questions. So thank you all for your great participation and engagement. For those of you who would still like to submit a question, there is time. So as a reminder, please use the chat feature located in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And with that, we'll get started with our first question here. In your experience with the book and the people you've interviewed for your blog, is there anything that surprised you or stands out in a positive way related to people's experiences in aging?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michelle. Thanks. I think the thing that I've enjoyed most, and I will say this is a biased sample, so this isn't empirical research, is that they're accepting aging. They're not fighting it. They enjoy all the life experiences that they've had, and they're still interested in how they can stay as healthy as they can into their older ages. So I think that's the thing that I've really enjoyed the most because, let's face it, this is a youth-obsessed culture, and when people start complaining to me about the wrinkles around their eyes or they have a little extra belly fat, my response is not everyone gets the privilege to get old. So let's stop complaining about it and let's embrace it, and I think that's what I'm seeing in a lot of the folks that I interview.
It sounds like a positive attitude goes a long way.
Yes.
The next question here is, can you maybe name 1 to 3 top things to make for a better experience for older adults in an acute care setting? Is there some kind of menu tweak or recommendation or something along those lines for those in an acute care setting?
That's a really interesting question. I would say that I think the idea of menu choice is really helpful, and I like that so many acute care facilities are doing that. I would say not to be afraid of using herbs and spices and things to really help with the aroma of food. Sometimes we put everybody on a low-sodium diet, and it's bland and it doesn't taste good. I'd also say keep the portions small. Sometimes people get really overwhelmed, especially in acute care, when there's a big amount of food. So keep the portions small and keep it flavorful. And then I would say just something special on the tray, if possible, a flower, a little message that's inspiring, but something to make that mealtime experience enjoyable because, nobody really just wants to sit in the hospital bed and eat off a tray, but something to help engage them.
Great. Another question here is very specific to the protein recommendations. Could you explain and expand upon the protein recommendations for older adults? Is there any more context you can provide there?
Well, I think that the research on this is really sort of stemmed from the research on sports nutrition, where we know the important role of protein in stimulating muscle protein synthesis. And then as the researchers were looking at that, some of the key researchers in that area, like you might know the name Stu Phillips or Luc Van Loon, they've all been speakers at lots of conferences, found that the older adults that they were working with were not responding as well to the amounts of protein that they were recommending for the younger adults. And then they went on then in that line of investigation with research and just kind of uncovered this idea that we really need to have more protein. The muscle just isn't as responsive. So that idea of needing more, needing quality, needing the timing has all stemmed from a good body of research from some of the top protein researchers.
Great. The next one here is about obesity reduction and maybe looking more at impact of child and adulthood obesity and some of the weight reduction efforts, and then how that might impact as one ages. So if you've been overweight or obese as a young adult or child and have gone through weight reduction efforts, how does that impact aging well?
Well, I'm not sure from a physiological standpoint, but what I would say is that obesity is a chronic disease. So that even if someone has reduced, they can't stop monitoring, and they can't stop exercising, and they can't stop watching what they eat. So I think that people who have reduced and they know that, but I think that's why the fad diets don't work so well. People go on a diet, they lose the weight, and then they forget that there were things they did to achieve that lower weight. So I think really treating it as a chronic disease is important. I think the medical establishment could do a better job with helping people like that as they get older to really help monitor their weight, and even maybe looking at body composition, because there is something called sarcopenic obesity where people are losing muscle mass but then they're still overweight or obese because they're putting on more fat. So I'd love the medical establishment, maybe the general practitioners, to get more involved with that. I know I always think about how many times you all go to the doctors and then they take your weight and they may even calculate a BMI and hand you the sheet, but they don't explain it. They don't really help you understand what that is. So I think that vigilance is probably the most important piece. And then looking at any of the comorbidities, what's blood pressure doing, what's blood sugar doing, what are the lipids like, what's the cardiometabolic risk. Those things might help to keep people in check and keep them thinking about keeping that reduced weight.
Okay. Our next question, we've had a couple questions about leucine come in. So I'm going to give you a two-part question here. One of them is, the first question is whether or not cooking affects leucine content in foods. And then the second one is a more practical application. So how do we help our clients know if they're eating higher leucine-containing foods, or how do we help them make sure that they're meeting those recommendations for spreading it throughout the day?
Great. Well, the first one, cooking doesn't affect it. If anything, cooking helps to break down some of the proteins so they're better digested, so cooking will not affect leucine content of food. And then the second part, I think the main thing is to just look for those high-quality protein sources. So we'll never see leucine on labels, but if people are eating complete protein sources, so that's going to include, the animal sources, seafood, fish, all kinds of meats, and dairy foods, whether it's cheese or yogurt or milk, that's all going to include complete protein. Then you're going to get a good quality protein with leucine. In terms of the other foods, if you just look at that list, what you'll notice is those are all of the foods that are higher in protein anyway. Soy protein is higher in leucine. Soy protein is one of those complete proteins, as you probably know. So even though it's a plant protein, it does have a good balance of all the essential amino acids. So I think any of those soy foods are good. And then these other foods are all those starchy beans or peas that are good sources of protein. So they're more protein than, let's say, the green bean, or there's more protein in, the kidney beans than there is in some other vegetables. So it really looks at the quality protein sources. And, I don't have other nuts on here, but they're going to be similar to peanuts. So whether it's, walnuts or almonds or pistachios or pecans or whatever nuts that you like, they're all also going to contain some leucine.
Okay, great. I think we have time for one more question, so this will be our last question. Out of the three components of aging, eating well, moving well, and being well, which of these do people struggle with the most in your experience? And maybe it changes as they age too, but can you comment on that?
Yeah, that's tough. I think it really depends on the person. I probably would say the eating well. As I think people know they're supposed to exercise and be active, and there's more emphasis on that. But I think people really struggle with eating well because there's so much good information about nutrition, but there's so much misinformation. So I find a lot of people are just confused and throw up their hands. Or they look for a superfood, and they think, well, if I just have a kale smoothie, then I can eat whatever I want the rest of the day. So they have a hard time balancing that out and just making good choices throughout the day and at every meal. So my experience, but of course I'm a dietitian, would be the eating well piece.
Great. I think that helps us all feel better about helping people make great choices then. Thank you so much for all the great questions and engagement today. But now it's time to conclude today's webinar. As mentioned earlier, you'll be asked to fill out a short survey at the conclusion of this program, and we'll be receiving an email shortly that will include links to the slides presented today and the continuing education certificates. You can go to bellinstitute.com and generalmillscf.com to explore our websites, which offer nutrition education resources, videos, scientific research, and menu inspirations. We also invite you to follow the Bell Institute on social media. This concludes today's program. Thank you all so much.